Welcome to another episode of the ASF Podcast. My name is Tanja Janko and I'm hosting the Science Vertical. In this season of the ASF Podcast, we are focusing on consciousness and philosophy of mind. And today we will be talking with David Peña-Guzmán about very fascinating question: do animals dream? And if they do, what does it tell us about their consciousness? David is Associate Professor of Humanities and Comparative and World Literature at San Francisco State University and the author of When Animals Dream: The Hidden World of Animal Consciousness. His work bridges philosophy, neuroscience, animal ethics, and consciousness. And in this book, he makes a bold and compelling argument that dreaming is not exclusive to humans and may offer profound insights into the minds of non-human animals. He is also a co-host of the Overthink podcast. Thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak about this subject.
What first sparked your interest in this topic, and why was dreaming a particularly interesting lens for thinking about animal consciousness?
Yeah, well, as a philosopher, before I began working on this project, I was already interested in non-human animals. And in particular, what drew me to the lives of non-human creatures was my growing realization that if you start incorporating other animals, it could be apes, elephants, or even evolutionarily more distant animals like bees or octopuses into philosophical debates, the introduction of animals really changes the terms that we use for thinking about many things in philosophy. So if you're having a philosophical debate about the nature of language, and suddenly you start incorporating animals, they put pressure on your definition of language, on your understanding of communication. If you are interested in moral theory, the relationships among animals in the wild, or our relationship to our own pets, suddenly makes us think about our moral duties and obligations and responsibilities in a new light than if we were exclusively focused on human beings. And so it doesn't matter what philosophical concept you're interested in, whether it's reason, morality, ethics, politics, justice, consciousness, you name it. The moment that non-human animals enter the conversation, you really have to go back to the drawing board and reimagine and reinvent the very concepts that you're using for illuminating that topic. And so as a philosopher already interested in animals for this reason, and also as a philosopher with an interest in the philosophy of mind, in theories about how we experience the world, how we experience time and space and emotions, I then came to the realization that you can't think about the nature of experience without considering the possibility that some of the things that we take to be central to our experience of the world, like our experience of dreaming every night, you can't assume that that's exclusively human. And so I came to the subject of animal dreaming somewhat accidentally. I didn't set out to write a book about the dreams of animals, which, to be honest, sounds like a very niche and esoteric topic. Rather, I really wanted to understand how an aspect of human experience that has a lot of cultural, political, and even mythological significance, which are our dreams, how that conversation would change if we were open to the possibility that dream experiences also appear in other animals. And of course, much to my surprise, I discovered that there is, in fact, a lot of science out there that suggests that many other animals dream when they are in the middle of their sleep cycle. And my goal in this book was to try to tease out the implications of this possibility.
As you mentioned, there is quite some science on animals dreaming. And this is what I would like to start with. So, as I understood, looking from human-centric perspective, a core problem in dream research is methodological. since human dream science relies very heavily on verbal reports, how can we study dreams in nonverbal animals? So some research that I've read, those researchers, for example, Moorcroft frames this as a central limitation. And even in human sleep science, thinkers like Dennett and Wintz highlight this as a unresolved metaphysical question. So if I directly quote them, they said, even in humans, the study of dreaming and consciousness during sleep poses both empirical and metaphysical questions. But your work kind of pushes against this barrier and says that language isn't the only sign of mind. And animals may express consciousness in ways that are embodied, emotional, and structured. Maybe it would make sense that we first start with just addressing how we look at the dream science in humans, or how do we approach studying dreams in humans, and then we can move on how we look at this in animals.
Yeah, of course. And thanks for this question, because I do think it's really important to recognize those methodological limitations, which I never want to deny. In fact, I want to foreground them because they tell us something about the limits of our own investigation into our own minds. So, if we begin with the case of humans, it's exceptionally difficult to study dreams. That's why, for a very long time, dreams were not considered a legitimate object of scientific research. They were considered quacky phenomena, paranormal phenomenon, very close to clairvoyance, very close to divination, things that put us in contact potentially with another realm, with a spiritual world. That changed really in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1960s and 70s, when a number of researchers began subjecting human dreaming to scientific analysis. But they still face this problem, which is that dreams are internal experiences. And they are internal experiences that happen under some of the most bizarre physiological conditions that a human can experience, which is sleeping, right? When we're completely disconnected from the world, our minds are not operating as they usually operate when we're awake. And so the question became how do we study these experiences that are largely internal and that happen during sleep? Now, of course, in the case of humans, we can determine whether or not a child dreams or a teenager dreams or an adult dreams by asking them to tell us about their dreams. You know, they can tell us their nightmares, their dreams, the content of their dreams, so on and so forth. In the case of animals, we don't have that because we don't share a common language with other species. But I think it would be a false inference to conclude from that therefore we can say nothing about the dream experiences of other animals. And the reason for that is that even in the case of humans, we rely on more than linguistic reports for thinking about dreams. We think about the behavioral patterns that are associated with dreaming. So we know that when we dream, we often we make movements with our bodies. Sometimes we speak in the middle of our dreams. Whatever we're saying in our dreams actually pierces through into the real world, and we let out expressions that reveal something about what we're dreaming about. There's also a lot of research, of course, in neuroscience about the neural patterns that get activated, the circuits and the pathways that light up at the point in the sleep cycle when we're most likely to dream. And so, although it is important to recognize that the absence of language poses a formidable challenge in our study of non-human animals across the board, this is not unique to dreaming. It's true for any aspect of animal experience. What I wanted to do in this book really was draw our attention to what we can say about the dream experiences of other animals. And in order to do that, I had to zoom in on the evidence that is available. And so I talk about two kinds of evidence that we have for thinking that, in fact, other animals do have dream experiences, these nightly reenactments that we call dreams. One category of evidence is what I call behavioral evidence. And we know that many animals do perform motor routines when they are asleep that are suggestive of a dream experience. Sometimes they might bark. Sometimes they might run even when they are asleep. So they are doing a performance that is significant in the life of these animals, but that is not happening in the context of their waking lives. Now, to be fair, these are very difficult to interpret because when we sleep, we also do all sorts of things that don't really mean anything. Sometimes we toss and turn, we move our legs, our hands might make random movements that are not correlated with anything happening internally. But there are some cases of motor performances that are so well organized, that are so globally coherent, that they are evidence on my interpretation of an internal reality. And so I talk about many of these so-called oneric behaviors. And the word oneric comes from the Greek root oneros, which means dreaming. And so in science, in neuroscience, in the neuroscience of dreaming, we refer to many of these behaviors that happen in the middle of the night as oneric when they seem to be linked to a dream. Now, aside from bodily performances like gestures, sounds, grunts, vocalizations of all sorts, we also have, as I noted a minute ago, brain activation patterns. And I think this really strengthens the case for dreaming in other species because we know that when animals enter into their own version of what is known as REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, parts of their brains are activated that are typically associated with the generation of an experience. That can be, for example, a visual experience or an auditory experience or a tactile experience. But the fact that those areas of the brain are lighting up at that particular time and that they're lighting up at the same time as we're seeing all these behavioral components getting activated starts painting a larger picture where both at the level of the body and at the level of the brain, these animals are suggesting to us in their own way that they are living through an experience that means something to them, even though, of course, we may not know exactly what they are dreaming about.
In the first chapter of your book, you give a lot of compelling examples from rats replaying the maze tasks during their REM sleep, to zebra finches rehearsing their songs at night. Maybe can you give us one of the examples that stood out to you the most? And yeah.
Yes, certainly. So I talk about rats the most in the book, and that's only because rats are, of course, the animal that we use in neuroscientific research most frequently. So we just happen to know a lot about their emotions, about their perceptions, about how they think, and so on and so forth. But for that reason, the case that stood out for me the most is the case of the zebra finches, because it was really unexpected. And just to put this into context, I want to point out that I'm not the first person to suggest that other animals dream. Other people have suggested that over the course of the history of science. It's a very old idea, in fact, that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. What's interesting is that some contemporary theories of animal dreaming have suggested that it's an exclusively mammalian heritage, that only mammals dream. And so that might include humans and elephants and dogs and cats, but it would exclude all non-mammalian species. And so the case of the zebra finches is interesting, at the very least from that perspective, because it broadens the horizons of that mammalocentric theory of dreaming that while already making some moves in the right direction, I still think is too limited. So to now get to the case of the zebra finches in particular, zebra finches are these little birds. They are native to Australia. And one of the challenges they face in their daily lives is that they need to learn a song as they grow up in order to lead a full, rich, complete zebra finch life. And that's because those songs are important for their mating practices and for their cultural lives. Now, the songs that these finches have to learn are not innate. That means that they're not born knowing those songs. Many songs in the bird world are innate. The songs of the zebra finch are not. And that means that the zebra finch has to learn the song. They have to memorize it. They have to practice it. The question is, how do they go about doing that? Now, some researchers had already proposed that one way in which zebra finches commit the song to memory is by practicing or rehearsing it during sleep. But one of the main interpretations of how that happened was that it was simply unconscious memory consolidation during sleep. And we know that happens in many animals, including humans, right? That if we're studying for a test or if we're trying to memorize information, when we go to sleep and when we enter deep sleep, our memories are storing information and sifting through the information that is important and the information that is not. And so our memories get strengthened unconsciously during sleep. As I began reading this research, I came to the realization that there were certain clues in the scientific findings that suggested that the zebra finches were not just sleeping and unconsciously processing the songs, but that they were actively dreaming about them. And that means that the kind of memory consolidation that was happening was partially conscious. They were having experiences that they were living through, and those experiences would be considered dreams. Now, the evidence for this really falls into the two categories that I just mentioned. Of course, there is the behavioral component. So if you look at zebra finches when they are sleeping, at the precise moment that they are working on their song internally, you realize that their bodies are doing things that are really revealing. For example, their throats are dilating and contracting in the exact way that they would have to do, or that they would have to contract and dilate in order to perform the song exactly as the song needs to be performed. Of course, they're not letting out sounds, but they are performing the throat movements, much like you would rehearse a song, quote unquote, silently, right? Like where you're just mouthing the words, but without actually emitting any sound. Now, that throat performance is happening at the same time as a lot of fascinating neural activity. On the one hand, we see the activation of what we call the bird song brain system. And those are areas of the bird brain that get activated only when the birds are singing. And so, of course, even though the animal is not producing sound, the parts of the brain that mean I am singing right now get activated. What is more, the auditory parts of the zebra finch brain also get activated. Now, that's very bizarre because why would the listening part of the brain suddenly light up in the middle of sleep when the zebra finch is, well, not really hearing anything? And I think the best, most comprehensive interpretation of all of these signs and of all of these patterns of activation is that the reason that sound production and sound reception systems are being activated is because that is true internally from the perspective of the lived experience of the animal. And that's what happens when we dream, right? When we dream, we hear things and see things that are not really there, but experientially speaking, they are real for us. And I think that those sounds are equally experientially real for these animals. And so in chapter 1 of the book, I lay out this particular case of the zebra finches as, I think, a really good illustration of how far we can go in making claims about the dreams of other animals, even though, of course, as we noted earlier, we cannot ask a zebra finch whether or not they have dreams.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, so this might have been an example from one of your lecture that you have online, but it really stuck in my mind. So it was about, I think it was a chimpanzee from the 80s when so these chimpanzees were in captivity, and they were taught the sign language for coffee, and apparently one of the chimpanzees was showing this sign for coffee during during sleep, and this kind of stuck in my mind as a very interesting example, also because it is a little bit weird that a chimpanzee knows a sign for coffee.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really unexpected finding. And it was so unexpected that I decided to track down the researcher who published that in the 1990s. And I asked her that very same question. It's a primatologist who studied chimpanzees in captivity. And when I found her, I asked her, this doesn't make sense. Why would a chimpanzee even know the concept for coffee and make the ASL, the American Sign Language, symbol for it? And she told me, well, obviously a wild chimpanzee wouldn't have a concept of coffee, but a captive chimpanzee would. And in this case, we did feed these animals coffee occasionally, and they loved it, because they would wake up, it would put them in an altered state of mind. And so for them, it was very much a treat. And so the case of the coffee drinking chimpanzee also draws our attention to the fact that animals are more likely to dream about things that are intrinsically rewarding. Much like us, we dream about things that we like, things that we want to have, things that we don't have in the waking world all the time. And so it's another example of a behavioral performance sort of seeping out of the dream world, making its way onto the real world, and being observable, legible, and interpretable by human observers.
Since we are still at animals, and there is another point that I really want to just mention before we move on. You have a very beautiful cover of your book. There is a very nice octopus on it, and there's also octopuses are also very interesting because they change colors during sleeping. So yeah, very, very interesting looking into the science of animals dreaming. Okay, but so if we move on, so you argue that dreaming entails a form of consciousness, or rather that dreaming is already achieving a conscious state, and that an egoless dream is kind of a contradiction. Would you mind explaining that a little bit?
Yeah, this is where we start moving from the domain of science to the domain of philosophy. And of course, I'm a philosopher by training, so I feel a lot more at ease with the philosophy than with the science, even though for this project, I had to read a lot of scientific research to be able to back up my claims. Now, here I think we need to step back for a minute and ask a fundamental question, which is, what is a dream? Of course, we often say that a dream is an experience that happens when we're sleeping, and it's an experience that is generated largely in a vacuum, meaning that we are seeing things, hearing things, touching things that don't really exist in our immediate surroundings. And that means that those experiences are endogenously created. They are created by me through a combination of things stored in my memory, as well as things that I'm imagining in the moment and combining the two to create this fantastical dream landscape that then in the moment feels real to me. Now, the important thing to underscore here is that when we dream from a particular position, right? We see the dream world much like we see the real world. Like at this particular moment in this interview, I am sitting on a chair and I see the world from the perspective of my chair. Similarly, when I dream that I am falling, which is a very common anxiety dream, I feel like I'm falling from a particular perspective, and that perspective is associated with my dream body. Now, the reason that I say in the book that there is no such thing as an egoless dream is simply to highlight this structural, architectural feature of all experience. And that is that all experience is experience from the perspective of me rooted in my body. Now, of course, this is not to deny the bizarreness of dreams. Dreams are extremely bizarre. Crazy things happen in dreams. For example, our bodies can change radically. Suddenly I have maybe tentacles, just like the octopuses that you mentioned. Or maybe I'm very small or very big in a dream. Who knows? But the point is that independently of what kind of body I have, of what kind of shape that body has, I dream my dream from an anchor point. And that anchor point already tells me something about the dream. And that is that it is subjectively organized. It is organized around a subjective center point. And that center point is what researchers in dream science and the philosophy of dreams call our dream ego. So just like we have an ego, a self, or an I in the waking world, we also have that in the dream world. And so one of my interests in thinking about dreams in connection to animals is revealed precisely in this concept of the dream ego. Because if dreams have an ego, a self, or a subjectivity at their center, and other animals are capable of dreaming, then we can make the conclusion that it is likely that other animals have a subjectivity of their own, that they have their own subjective point of view from which they experience reality. And that already is a radical claim in a world where we, to be honest, have really poor views about the mental lives of other animals. And so understanding this connection between dreaming, subjectivity, humanity, and animality helps me rethink those terms and try to convince the readers that other animals really do have a sense of self that is not identical to ours, but that does have this fundamental similarity.
You also talk about the SAM model or SAM model in your book. So S standing for subjective, A standing for affective, and M for metacognitive. And this also kind of frames dreaming as proof of conscious interiority, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. The SAM model, SAM, is a model that I invent in the book, that I create in the book, to help us think about consciousness in other animals. Because, of course, when we ask the question whether other animals are conscious, the question always becomes, as it should, well, conscious in what way? Because there are different ways of being conscious. So in the book, I identify these three ways of thinking about consciousness, or three types of conscious awareness. One of them is subjective awareness, which is connected to this notion of the ego. It's having experiences that are rooted in an ego or in a self. Then there is also affective consciousness, which refers more to having emotional experiences, having feelings, sentiments, and emotions. And I think that that's something that we find in most, if not all, animals. Of course, the emotions are not the same. Some animals have emotions that we don't have. We have emotions that they don't have. But affect, understood as the capacity to judge something's good and something's bad, so it's a very basic understanding of affect, runs very deep in the animal kingdom. Now, the third kind of consciousness is maybe a little bit more complex because it's more demanding, and that is metacognition. Metacognition simply refers to the ability of an organism not just to have thoughts, but to think about its own thoughts. So you can think about this as reflexivity, the ability of the mind to fold back onto itself and think about its own contents. That's why it's called metacognition, because it is cognition about cognition. Now, once we lay out these three types of conscious awareness, the question is, what connection do they have to dreams? And my view about this moves in stages from one type to the next sequentially. My argument is that as soon as you recognize that a non-human animal is a dreamer, two things follow immediately from that. It follows, as I just said, that that animal is a subject, a self, an ego, because they do have that subjective anchoring in the dream world. And secondarily, it also means that that animal has affective consciousness as well. And that's because dreams always have an emotional component. We dream about things that we want to happen, or sometimes, as in the case of nightmares, we dream about things that we really do not like. Either way, every dream has some tinge of affect, sentiment, or emotion. And so the fact that other animals dream gives us this window into their subjective and emotional lives. And so it opens up these further avenues for research into the animal mind. Now we can start asking further questions. Well, what kind of ego do they have? What kinds of emotions do they exhibit? Now, the last category, metacognition, is the one that is more speculative on my part. And so I want to be clear about that, because it's an argument from possibility. And the argument there is that there are a few animals, not many, that seem to have metacognitive capacities in the waking world. That includes some birds, that includes non-human primates, and it might include some other animals like elephants, for example. And that means that these animals think things, but they also think about what they think. Now, could dreaming help us understand metacognition? Now, I don't want to get too far into this element of the book. I encourage listeners to check out the argument in detail in the book. But there is one kind of dreaming that is metacognitive by nature, and that is what is called lucid dreaming. Occasionally, we've all had those dreams where you're in the middle of a dream and wild things are happening all around you. And then suddenly you have this metacognitive insight that this is not the real world. I am in a dream right now. And so I propose as a possibility that animals that we already have reason to believe are metacognitive agents might be capable of lucid dreaming, because lucid dreaming is just metacognition in sleep, right? It's metacognition and dreaming put together. And if that's the case, then those animals would have this high order cognitive capacity that for a very long time we've limited exclusively to human beings. But again, this is a speculative claim, and a claim that I think is possible based on our current knowledge, but we do not know, at least as of now, as a matter of fact, whether any non-human animal actually has lucid dreams, because they are even harder to study than traditional dreams. So all those methodological problems that we talked about in connection to dreams only magnify in connection to lucid dreams.
Do you believe that the content of animal dreams could one day be studied and interpreted thoroughly through neuroscience, like even the lucid dreaming? Or do you think that there are some fundamental limits to how much we can know about other species in the world?
One conclusion that I want to avoid readers taking away from this book is the idea that animals dream like we dream. The argument is that we dream and that other animals dream, but it does not mean that our dreams are identical or transferable. And that's because just like our dreams are reflections of our bodily capacities and of our cognitive capabilities, so too the dreams of other animals are reflections of the kinds of bodies that they have, the kinds of brains that they have, the kinds of evolutionary histories and ecological niches that they have. And so I believe that there will always be a gap in our knowledge of the dream experiences of other animals. We can know that they dream, and in some cases, we might be able to make very good educated guesses about what they might be dreaming about. For example, this animal right now is dreaming of a song, like in the case of the zebra finches, or this animal is having a nightmare, because we see all the physiological and psychological signals of a nightmare. But I want to resist the conclusion that humans will ever have complete mastery over the inner landscape of non-human creatures. And for me, that limit is something that needs to be stressed both for epistemological reasons, but also for moral reasons. Epistemologically, I think it's just true that there will always be a gap between us and other animals because we are different formulations of what it means to be alive. But morally, I think it's important to underscore that difference as a mark and as a signal of moral respect. If we thought that other animals are just like us and that we can reduce them to our categories and to our concepts, I think we would be committing an ethical transgression because we would not be respecting what makes other animals other. And so that logic of difference or alterity is really important to my work, especially when I think about the ethical dimensions of human animal relations. And so I think that keeping in mind that other animals have their own lives, their own interests, their own desires, their own aspirations is essential for developing better moral relationships with them.
A very important thing to keep in mind, that we are two very different, because sometimes we start to think about the world from a very human centric perspective, as let's say in astronomy we view the universe from a very very earth centric perspective. So yeah, I think that is a very easy thing that we always do.
Yeah, and I think that the shift from that geocentric perspective in astronomy to a heliocentric perspective is a shift that is beginning to happen now in the domain of biology and ethology, where we used to think that humans are the center of the universe. And now we're coming to the realization that, in fact, we're just one of many planets, all of which are orbiting one another in existence, but none of which can claim to be the center of the universe because, as we know from physics, the universe does not, in fact, have a center as we used to believe. And so the Copernican revolution in astronomy, I think, is only now beginning really in the domain of the animal sciences, but it's been a long time in the making.
Do you think that is thought necessarily linguistic? What do animals dream? So that might be rich in like imagery and emotion. Would that suggest what would that suggest about imagination and consciousness in species without language?
For a long time, linguists and philosophers of mind have made the argument that our thinking process is inherently linguistic. That, for example, our attitudes towards the world, whether that is belief, doubt, desire, can be expressed in linguistic form, right? So a belief is, I believe that X, Y, or Z. And that has made many people adopt a language-centric understanding of human experience, where every aspect of human experience can be understood as having a linguistic structure. Now, this is a result of what is sometimes called the linguistic turn in the 20th century, which refers to a movement, again, in linguistics and philosophy, but in many other disciplines as well, that occurred in the early 20th century, where a lot of people became very excited about thinking about the world and human experience through the lens of language. Now, I belong to a group of philosophers who happen to believe that the linguistic turn was a mistake, in that it made people convinced that language was the key that opened every single door. In the case of dreams, for example, a number of people made the claim that every dream is linguistic, and therefore animals, since they don't have language, by definition, they cannot dream. But the problem with this inference is that it begins from a problematic presupposition. And that is the presupposition that in order to think and in order to have experience, you first need to have mastery of a human-styled language, right? A language with verbs and adjectives, a language with subjects and predicates. But in recent decades, people have begun breaking out of the grip of this linguistic interpretation of thought. And what we are coming to realize is that, of course, there are many ways to think about what thinking is that don't have anything to do with language. For example, I can think in images. I can imagine and visualize literally what happened to me yesterday. I'm not doing that with words. I'm not doing that with concepts. I'm doing that with visual content that replicates the episode that I experienced. And I can push that very far back. I can go as far back as my memory allows me to. I can remember or represent my 7th birthday party by just thinking about the images that are stored in my memory. We also can think in other ways and also communicate. For example, we can communicate through body language. That's not always linguistic. In fact, most of it is not. We can experience communication through gestures as well. And we also can think about the world through various forms of mental modeling, such as cognitive maps. So, for example, when I think about space, when I think about how I will get home, I don't necessarily think in a sequence of sentences that give me instructions about how to get home, right? I don't think first turn right, walk 20 feet, then turn left. Rather, I think about the map of my environment, which is not linguistic. A map it's a visual representation of space, and then I use it to navigate my way through space. Now, all these insights about thinking and language, and And the decoupling, really, of thought from language have allowed us to make significant advances in the study of human and non-human cognition. And so overall, I consider myself a critic of the linguistic turn and a critic of the linguistic interpretation of thought, and an even harsher critic of the notion that all experiences are fundamentally linguistic. And I take that criticism on my part to grow out of my desire for us to think about the experience of non-linguistic creatures, like non-human animals. Because if you begin from the assumption that everything is language, then you're forced into a corner when it comes to other animals. And we might even say, even in connection to infants, and it pushes you into a corner. It almost forces you to say that these animals cannot think, and maybe that they cannot have experiences, which I take to be utterly incoherent.
Exactly, and then this goes into a lot of moral and ethical implications, to which we will get very soon, right after I mentioned this. So you referenced Wittgenstein's lion. So he said, if a lion could talk, we could not understand him. And so you raised this philosophical monster or non-conscious dreamer reference. So why is this concept important to your case, and how is dreaming the evidence of conscious experience?
At the heart of my research is the idea that we learn something about the consciousness of other animals by looking at their dreams. And that's because of all the things we already talked about. Dreams are subjective, dreams are emotional, dreams might have a connection to metacognition. And because dreams are found in many species, in many branches of the tree of life, they really help us unsettle the idea that only humans have this thing that we call consciousness or mind or sentience. Now, of course, somebody could say, well, maybe animals have dreams, but that doesn't mean that they're conscious. Maybe we separate those two conversations. This is where my engagement with the philosopher Wittgenstein in the book comes in. Now, citing Wittgenstein and referencing some of his work, I make the claim that the very idea that you could dream but not be conscious is illogical. It literally doesn't make sense. And so I use this phrase from Wittgenstein, which is the concept of a philosophical monster, which he used to refer to things that just don't go together. It's something that it's so nonsensical that no philosopher should even consider accepting. And so, on my view, the idea that dreaming could be unconscious is a philosophical monster. And the reason for that is really definitional. It really has to do just with what it is to dream. To go back to a definition that I gave a few minutes ago, to dream is to have sensations, precepts, experiences, thoughts, ideas in the context of sleep. That means that at their most fundamental level, dreams are lived events. They are lived experiences that we have. And as lived experiences, they are things of which we are conscious while they are happening. When you dream, there is a world that presents itself to you, the dream world. It manifests for you, it lights up for you. That lighting up, that manifestation, that opening up of a field of experience is also what we mean by consciousness. And so a dream is by definition a conscious experience because it's something that we are living through. And that's very different than the many non-conscious events that happen in our brains and in our bodies all the time. So, for example, right now, there is blood running all over my circulatory system. I'm not aware of that. I'm not living it, even though it's a precondition for my life. Similarly, there is all kinds of synapses going off in my brain. I don't feel them, even though they are a precondition for my thinking. Those events are unconscious or preconscious because they never actually appear as an object of my experience, right? Like I am not aware of them. I can think about them if I want to, but it's at a separation or from a distance. When we dream, we're not thinking about dreams from a distance. We are in the dream, in the flesh, in the moment from our subjective anchoring point. And so there is a very intimate connection between dreaming and being conscious. And the way I articulate the connection is that dreaming is always already a sufficient condition for consciousness. Meaning that if you know that somebody is capable of dreaming, you don't need to know anything else about them to conclude that they are indeed conscious agents, that they have consciousness, sentience, mind. Now, that doesn't mean that dreaming is a necessary condition for consciousness. It's just that it's sufficient for consciousness. And the reason I want to dissociate sufficiency and necessity is because, of course, we know that there are people, human beings out there, who are incapable of dreaming, but that doesn't mean that they are not conscious agents, right? And that just has to do with the fact that there are many ways of proving that somebody is conscious, and dreaming just happens to be one of them. Hence, it's a sufficient but not necessary condition for consciousness.
So, as I already said, the whole discussion that we are having today is also heavily implicating the moral and ethical status of animals. So you argue that the phenomenal consciousness, so the ability to feel, is the true foundation of moral status. So if dreaming is a phenomenally conscious state, then animals who dream must also matter morally. So how do you see that these debates that you're having are shifting animal ethics?
Let me say that this moral dimension of the book, where I talk about animal ethics and animal rights, is really the motivation behind the book as a whole. Of course, I'm interested in the cognitive side of things, but at the end of the day, I think one of the reasons for pushing this debate about animal minds is because I hope it will lead to a better treatment of animals. Once we realize that other animals really have experiences that are as deep and as complex and as multifaceted as ours, but in their own way, hopefully we will change the way we relate to them, the way we treat them in laboratories, in aquaria, the way we treat them in factory farms, the way we even treat them in our own homes. Now, to make the connection to ethics here more explicit, we have to go all the way to the very beginning of ethical theory. And I don't mean the beginning historically, where ethical theory began, but to the most fundamental questions in moral theory. And the most important question from which ethics begins is, who should I treat well and why? In other words, of all the things that exist in the universe, toward which things do I have certain moral obligations? Now, the way in which most, although not all, schools of moral theory resolve this question is by invoking the concept of consciousness in one way or another. There are some things in the universe that are conscious, self-aware, sentient, minded, like human beings, for example. And there are many things that just don't have that, like atoms don't have that, planets don't have that, chairs and tables don't have that property. So the things that don't have that don't matter morally, but the things that do have that. and therefore should be objects of moral care and moral concern. So the first step in our thinking about the connection between animal minds and animal ethics is to recognize this connection between having consciousness and mattering morally. Now, of course, the concept of consciousness is very fickle. There are many definitions of consciousness, and there's a lot of debate, of course, about who really is and who is not conscious. Are people in a comatose state conscious? There's debate historically about that. Are nematodes, are bacteria, are viruses conscious? What about individual living cells? What about plants? Where do we draw the line? And so merely saying that the entities in the world that matter are those who have consciousness is not quite enough, because there are many different competing conceptions of consciousness that sometimes include more things and sometimes include less. So I favor a relatively open definition of consciousness that is rooted in the philosophical concept of phenomenality or phenomenal consciousness, where the kinds of entities that matter, on my view, are those that have experiences, those that have feelings, those that perceive, those that sense. And that's just my theoretically sophisticated way of saying animals. Animals matter morally because they sense, because they move, because they perceive, because they remember, because they imagine, because they have all the things that, when we think about it, are the things that we want to protect. They're the kinds of creatures that deserve some kind of respect. Now, to be clear, my way of cutting the pie includes animals, but it excludes plants. So on my view, really, this is an animal-centric conception. And what I ultimately want to suggest in the moral chapter of the book, which is the one that brings the book to a close, is that dreams really highlight this dimension of animal experience. And I contrast that dimension of animal experience, which is about embodiment and feeling and sensation, to another dimension of human experience that sometimes people think is the one that really matters for moral debates. And that has to do with rationality and concepts and abstraction. And my view is that if you really limit the kinds of entities in the universe that matter morally to those that have language and abstract concepts and reason, you're going to end up with a highly restrictive moral universe that excludes a lot of entities that really should not be excluded. And so, using dreams, I make the argument that dreams are a good example of what is at stake in the debate between these two conceptions of moral mattering, between the rational one and the emotional one. Because if you think about it, dreams are not rational. If anything, they're extremely irrational. They are illogical. And we know, even from a neuroscientific perspective, that the parts of the prefrontal cortex that are associated with centralized control and rational thinking are, in fact, deactivated while we are dreaming. And yet, we wouldn't want to say that animals that have the kinds of experiences that happen in dreaming don't matter morally. And so I draw a connection between dreams and theories of morality to draw this ultimate conclusion in the book that once you know that an animal dreams, and again, that includes a lot of animals, it includes mammals and birds and fish. So we're talking about really a lot of creatures out there. Once you know that they are conscious, and moreover, that they are conscious in the way that is important for moral theory. Therefore, you are justified in extending moral protections to any creature that is capable of dreaming.
Of course, you can never know what the other person or also in this case, animals are experiencing. So, yeah, I mean, of course, we are viewing other people and also all the animals who are most similar to humans as being conscious. But the further you go away from the human form or the human presentation of emotion or reactions, um, the more difficult it is to think that this animal or object is experiencing or having, being conscious.
Yeah, and I think that's something that all of us can relate to, right? That when we look at an ape, we see a lot of us in an ape for very good reasons, genetic, evolutionary reasons, even morphological reasons. They look and act very much like us. As you start moving towards other mammals, then towards fish, then maybe even towards amphibians, to fish, so on and so forth, our understanding of our own consciousness becomes less and less applicable to other animals. And so it makes us feel uneasy. Sometimes it even makes us believe that those animals must not be conscious, must not be capable of feeling or sentience or pain or pleasure simply because they are different from us. But I want to be clear that this is a problem with us and not with them. This is a problem about our capacity to imagine and about our apparent need to project our own subjectivity onto the non-human world. The fact that fish are not like humans matters to humans, but it doesn't matter to fish. Fish are fish and they're leading their own fishy lives in the ocean, and they can have complete flourishing lives independently of what we think about them. And so I think we need to be very careful about not confusing a limitation of our perspective with a natural shortcoming in other species, which sounds obvious, but I think is a mistake that we make quite frequently. And of course, this goes back to the discussion about Copernicus and planets. We need to remember, right, that when you begin from an anthropocentric perspective, you're already making an error, because you're beginning from one arbitrary case and expecting all of the natural world to satisfy the criteria of that case. And just to put this into perspective, I mean, there are millions and millions of animal species in nature. We humans are just one of them. We have zero reason to expect that we are special or privileged in any way. And what's more important also, I think, is that when we project our human subjectivity onto other animals, we're also very arbitrary in the aspect of our humanity that we select as the thing that we want to look for in other animals, right? We often take the thing that we are most proud of, and then we judge other animals for falling short of that. Like, other animals don't have syntax, or other animals don't have rules of punctuation, or other animals don't have poetry, or they don't have cubist painting. But why do we select that when not all of us are cubist painters? Not all of us master punctuation. That doesn't seem to be what's most important about us. Why not foreground other aspects of our humanity that do apply to other animals? For example, what if we said, one important thing about our humanity is our embodiment, the fact that we have bodies that are essential for our survival. Well, suddenly other animals very quickly meet that. Um, what if we said, well, we humans have a natural waking sleeping cycle that governs our lives? Well, that seems to be nearly universal in the animal kingdom. So why not select that instead? And so I think we do need to hold up a mirror to ourselves when we do these projective maneuvers, and we need to ask two questions. One is, why are we beginning with the human case at all? And second, why are we beginning with this particular achievement of the human case rather than any other?
So we are slowly coming to the end of our conversation. But before we close off, I have two more questions. And one of those is, do you think that dreaming can be seen as kind of evolutionary achievement, as a sign that an organism has reached a level of interior depth and has like a narrative structure that goes beyond like the simple reactivity?
I recently published an article in the magazine Aeon, Aeon, where I talk about this precise issue. So I might refer our listeners to that magazine, which is geared for a public audience. And there I make an argument that I get from a Spanish philosopher who lived in the 19th and 20th century. And he argues, let me just get his name in order to make sure I don't make an error in his full name. And the philosopher's name is Jose Miguel Gardia, and he wrote this piece in 1892 about dreams, where he says that dreams are evidence that animals have what he calls sensibilité. Sensibilité is a French word because he wrote this article in French. And sensibilité is a really interesting word because, of course, you can translate that as sensation, just like feeling things from the world and reacting to them. But in French, the word sensibilité actually has a lot of other associations and other meanings. It does mean sensation, but it also has echoes of more complex concepts like sentience, sensoriality, sentiment, sensibility, and even just sense, as in sense and meaning. And his point, as I interpret it, is that dreams are so complex that, yes, we can say that they are sensory experiences because we hear and think, we hear, we sense things through all the sensory modalities, but they also have a sense in the sense that they have a meaning, and they also have emotions built into them in the sense that they are sentimental. And so all of these meanings are kind of blended in very complex ways in dreams. And that's because dreams cannot possibly be mechanical or automatic reactions to an external stimulus. Why not? Because by definition, since we're asleep when we dream, we're not actually responding or reacting to anything in our surroundings. And so in my book, I point out that dreams are hyper creative and they draw our attention to the fundamentally productive or creative nature of the human mind, because a dreamer is somebody who has the capacity to generate from within themselves an entire world of experience that is fantastical and wonderful. And if other animals have that, it means that they are creative artists at the level of their minds and bodies. And they are not, as we have thought for a long time, just living machines that respond to the world in instinctual, predictable, mechanical ways. And so, to answer the question, I do think it is an evolutionary achievement of sorts, but I'm not sure that it's the only evolutionary achievement that matters. But it does highlight the fact that sometimes our experiences of the world are more complex than they seem at first sight. And dreaming, I think, is a perfect illustration of that complexity, because hopefully by now, at the end of our conversation, we can see that something as simple as closing your eyes and feeling something, once you start teasing apart the scientific and the philosophical implications, really becomes a portal into discussions that maybe you didn't anticipate at the beginning. Dreams reveal complex thought processes. They reveal complex emotions. They reveal complex memory, complex imagination. And overall, they reveal complex beings in the universe other than human beings.
And maybe for our final question, is there something that we maybe didn't discuss and you would like to say as your closing statement? And also maybe if you have any final recommendations for people who would be interested to dive deeper into this topic.
Well, I will say that although this book is exclusively about dreams, dreams belong to a larger spectrum of non-ordinary experiences. There are many non-ordinary experiences that we have. Sometimes they're called altered states of mind. There are dreams, of course, but then there are also things like perceptual illusions, hallucinations, meditation, intoxication. All of these states raise different kinds of questions. And I want to conclude just by noting that my next book project, which I'm beginning to work on now, will look at that broader spectrum of altered states of consciousness in non-human animals, focusing specifically on intoxication, as well as various forms of mental focus in other animals. Without naming particular books or particular authors, in the last couple of decades, there have been a number of trends in the study of animals that I find really fascinating and I think can be intriguing for a general audience. The two that I'll mention here are, first and foremost, works on animal politics. A lot of political scientists, sociologists, historians, philosophers are helping us rethink our relationship to other animals politically, speaking in terms of animal rights, animal obligations, and also political institutions. For instance, I said I wouldn't name books, but I would recommend a book called Zoo Politics that talks about the different kinds of rights that different animals should have depending on the kind of relationship they have to human communities. So wild animals maybe have certain rights that domestic companions do not have, and vice versa. There's also been interest in the concept of animal culture. Do other animals have full-blown cultures? That is, habits and patterns of comportment that are passed down from one generation to another through non-genetic means. I myself have published on the subject. I've written about cultural practices in cetaceans, which are whales and dolphins. And this is an area of our thinking about animals that I think is very promising because, of course, culture, of all the things that we can use to differentiate humans from other animals, seems like a very good candidate. Humans have culture, other animals don't. But once you rethink the concept of culture and broaden it, it does seem like actually other animals, especially those that live in complex societies, have their own cultural traditions, their own cultural customs that they protect and preserve and pass down. Finally, and I am biased in this regard just because of my interests, I would recommend people to read works that are published in the field of animal experience and animal cognition. Some of these deal with particular experiences, like my own book on dreams, but many others focus on particular species, telling us, everything there is to know about dogs or cats or giraffes. And so I would encourage people simply to read more broadly about the environment and nature, independently of what specific angle they find interesting, whether that is philosophy, sociology, or literature. In fact, I think it's always good to read across the disciplines.